Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is our waddle through all the penguins that have been in my life, past, present, and yet to come. And today we are dealing with a text that has had a massive amount of influence, even though most people don't know it, in the 21st century. A massive amount of literary influence, but also a massive amount of real-world influence from real-world navigators and business people and whatnot. And it's this thing. It's the travels of John Mandeville. In a deceptively slim volume from Penguin, this is translated by C.W.R.D. Mosley. Just parenthetically, I really hate the fashion that was prevalent for the early years of Penguin Classics of having their translators and editors just load on every first initial without actually giving us names. I hate that. I just hate it. C.W.R.D. Mosley did the translations here, and I assure you that my hatred of that convention is not going to lead me to overly criticize this person's work. We don't know anything about John Mandeville. There are all sorts of local guesses, especially people that think they're related to him or that once did. We don't know anything about him other than when he writes his book. That is the typical thing that people say. I think that C.W.R.D. Mosley even says that himself in his own introduction. Everybody that writes about this thing, and nobody does anymore, but once upon a time people did in vast amounts, and everybody always says, well, we don't know anything more about him than what he writes in his book. But it's pretty clear that we don't know that either, because this is pretty fabulistic, this book. And this purports to be the travels of an Englishman between 1332 thereabouts and 1356, or maybe 1366. It was around 1356 to 1360, something like that, that this book started to appear. And as far as we can tell, it originated in French, in a kind of William the Conqueror Norman-esque French that was pretty popular at the day. The French that this was originally written in was a kind of, actually, as the term implies, a lingua franca. So it wasn't unusual that an Englishman might do that if it's an Englishman that actually did it. But it helps a lot. It helped this book a lot because suddenly it was in a continental language instead of merely in English. Like a lot of English people that I knew when I traveled in England thought they thought this was written by an Englishman in English. No, no. And the fact that it was written in a kind of French, a very accessible kind of French, meant that this was read incredibly widely and copied everywhere. There are hundreds of manuscripts of this, all of them differing just slightly, lots of them displaying an odd or jumpy provenance and weird textual relationships with each other, so that when C.W.R.D. Mosley had to sit down and figure out what to do, whether C.W.R.D. Mosley was approached by Penguin or thought that this was just a preoccupation, I want to bring John Mandeville in front of the 20th century reading public, which this book certainly did. Regardless of what C.W.R.D. Mosley's motivation is, he then had to decide, well, what am I going to translate? Am I going to translate that? What edition am I going to do? Am I going to translate that original French version? Am I going to translate some of the very earliest English versions? Not translate, but brush them up, annotate an edition of them. But this went into a whole bunch of other languages too. And it shrunk or grew in size depending on what those languages were. This translator, C.W.R.D. Mosley, picks one manuscript, really what the crown species of one manuscript tradition, and translates that here. And I was very happy. I've always been very happy that Mandeville is in the Penguin line. I have no idea if they still print this volume, but this got into schools. It's got into the high schools and colleges. It's short, so it got into schools and gave Mandeville a very wide reading public for, I believe, the last time. I don't think Mandeville is taught in schools anymore. I don't think this manuscript is brought to anybody's attention anymore, and never will be again. So In the 19th century, Mandeville was hugely famous. In the 18th century, hugely famous, hugely influential. Explorers, actual explorers, Martin Frobisher, for instance, or Christopher Columbus, consulted this thing. They consulted this book wondering, is it telling me things? Can I prize out of it geographical and geophysical facts that I might need in my own actual explorations? Which is a bit ironic because, like with the travels of Marco Polo, or even going back as far as Herodotus, questions arose right from the beginning about this book, about whether or not John Mandeville, if that is the author, ever traveled anywhere. There's so much fabulous, obviously mythical stuff in here that it's an open question. Did this guy ever leave his hometown? One critic said, rather famously, speaking on behalf of frustrated critics for centuries, said that in his opinion, the greatest journey that John Mandeville ever took was to his local library. I wouldn't go that far. I think, if I remember correctly, that C.W.R.D. Moseley, in his introduction and in his notes, this is a... The street is completely empty. There have been 2 cars in the street all day. There is no reason for you to run a siren. There's no reason for you to clear traffic out of your way. There is no traffic. The street is completely empty. But anyway, what was I saying? Right. I believe that C.W.R.D. Moseley says in his version of Mandeville that he thinks Mandeville did travel. Maybe not as far as he says or as extensively as he does. There's quite a bit of Benvenuto Cellini in these books, in these chapters, quite a bit, where he meets the Sultan of Egypt and his offer to slave girl, but says, oh no, I must not, my morals. Or he meets and becomes a bosom friend with the great Khan and sees all sorts of things, fruits that have animals germinating inside them and whatnot. Stuff that, tall tales, travelers' tales that we know aren't true. We know they aren't true. And so you, start tracing, well, okay, what's the etiology of that story? We know it's not true, but where does it come from? And what might be the kernel that originally gave rise to it somehow, in the mists of time? Did somebody in the southern part of the Asian continent, or maybe northern India, come across a big carnivorous plant, for instance? Big carnivorous plants can, on occasion, take small rodents. If a shrew or a small mouse were to lose itself in such a plant, it could die. It could be eaten by that plant. Is it possible that somewhere 1,000 years ago, somebody opened up one of those plants and found a mouse and thought, oh, not that it's eaten by the plant, but that it's growing inside the plant? We don't know. You can do that on the one hand, and on the other hand, you can try and figure out what manuscripts Mandeville got those stories from, because he did a huge amount of reading. To make this book, he did a huge amount of reading. There are literary traces all throughout here of the earlier fantastical travel logs. It was a big, booming travel industry, publishing industry. He obviously read a lot of those travel logs. That's part of what makes it so easy to accuse him of simply cribbing in his armchair, not ever going anywhere. There's a religious element in this book as well. There's a very strong religious element here in how we are all journeying along a dark path that Bunyan borrowed from this thing very heavily. Where that element also, you can't separate it from this book. You can separate it a little bit more from some of the manuscript traditions than others. Not really from this one, which reflects right back on C.W.R.D. Moseley, and it would on any translator. Because the real great translated edition, the real great edition of Mandeville, as far as I know, has never happened. I've often advocated this for Marco Polo. I would advocate it even more for Mandeville, since there are so many manuscripts. I say, make an Mandeville. Something that, of course, is 3 times this size. Collate the different versions in all the different languages. Collate their literary traditions. Look at the differences. Look at the similarities. Look at the notes made by the original translators into those languages hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and put it all together in one book. If such a book exists, it's probably a very expensive academic press. I would love it if There's no interest in Mandeville anymore, but if there were, I would love it if that interest actually carried such a book into a popular press like this. But this will do. This is almost certainly the only version of the Travels of John Mandeville that you're ever going to come across. It's the Penguin Classic. So maybe we should take a look at whether or not C.W.R.D. Mosley does a good job. Let's take a look. Again, we don't, with a good job, keep in mind, we're not only talking about fidelity to the original, especially since in this case it's so hard to put your hand on the original. We're also talking about whether or not it's a reading experience for you in English. So let's read a little bit here and see. One day afterwards, it happened that the Khan was riding with a small company to see the lands he had won. And suddenly he met a great multitude of his enemies. Being a good warrior, he went boldly in front of all his men against his enemies to give his followers an example and the will to fight. He was struck from his horse, and it was killed. When his men saw him on the ground, they thought he had been killed and fled, and their enemies followed, not knowing that the king had been struck from his horse. When the Khan saw his enemies had gone, he went to a nearby wood and hid in a thick bush. When the enemies returned from the pursuit, they went to search the wood to see if anyone was hiding there, and they found many and killed them. So it happened that they came near the place where the king was hidden, and saw a bird, an owl, sitting on the tree under which the king lay concealed. When they saw that bird sitting so still, each one said that no man was in that place. So they went away, and so this king was saved from death, and rejoined his men under cover of darkness. When they saw their lord living, they were very glad and thanked Almighty God, and the bird, who had saved their lord from death and delivered him out of the hands of his enemies. Ever since that time, men of that land have done great honor to that bird above all others, and they love it so much that when a man can get a feather from it, he looks after it reverently, as if it were a relic, carrying it on his head with great respect, thinking it to be blessed thereby and saved from all kinds of dangers. Afterwards, the Khan gathered all his men and rode against his enemies, destroying them utterly. I think we can maybe agree that's bad. That's bad translating, regardless of the original. That's bad translating. The Khan becomes king and then goes back to being a Khan. So there's a long section in the middle of the paragraph where you don't know who's being talked about. And the wording is so stiff and awkward. And if you say that you are, as I believe this translator does say, if you say that you're intending it to be stiff and awkward because the original is stiff and awkward, very courtly, well, that's not good enough. That's not good enough at all. There are plenty of ways to write stiff prose that isn't this stultifying. Plenty of ways to do that. What was it? When they saw that bird sitting so still, each one said that no man was in that place. It's not very good. And I can tell you that most of the rest of the book, translated by C.W.R.D. Mosley, is likewise stiff and off-putting. It's the rendition of what's there, but without the life. And without the life that, without knowing the original language, had to be there in the original. Otherwise, there wouldn't be hundreds of manuscripts. Otherwise, there wouldn't be translations into dozens of languages. You wouldn't do that if that fire weren't there. So, and it's not there in this book, in this English translation. So this Penguin Classic leaves a little to be desired. But John Mandeville might be worth your time to get to know. You never know. So we'll wrap this up for now, and we'll move on next time to our next Penguin. Thank you, BookTube.